here, it's just worth noting that there is some history of in the US of there being union and worker representation on large corporate boards. Teresa Ghilarducci spoke about her experience earlier today. I wrote in the paper about cited some of the people who I've learned from who have had these kind of experiences. And I think there's questions here about what kinds of in parallel changes to to director fiduciary duty would be necessary for this to be meaningful. In other words, if you stick workers, elect them to the corporate board, but then tell them their entire reason to be there is to maximize shareholder value, what have you done? So this needs to be, I think, a parallel conversation with questions of board fiduciary duty. And then finally, and again, to me, the most interesting question, what kind of worker organization would this necessitate? And note, I'm not saying on purpose, I'm not saying works councils, or I'm trying to be like very broad in my language of what this could actually look like. And I think there's a lot of interesting exploration right now about how this idea forming sort of collective bodies of workers that's bounded in some way, who would then elect worker representatives to the board. There's a lot of really good questions about how that would interact with both current and also proposed reforms for US labor law. I think we have to, obviously no one wants, or I do not want company unionism. None of us want that. So the question is what kinds of structures would actually accomplish the goals that we have, which goes to, I think, some of the strategic points that people have also made today about how does US labor feel about this? I had the same reaction, I forget who mentioned it before, but when Representative Garcia said that he thought that labor was all about this, I thought to myself, that's just not what I've heard. So that's an interesting question. And then finally, in my last 30 seconds, there is an alternative proposal from former Chief Justice of the Delaware Supreme Court, Leo Strine, to turn the board compensation committee into to essentially make sure that they have a duty to consider the overall workforce compensation and conditions. Would there be a worker voice in that committee? That's a little bit unclear still in his proposal, I think. But I thought that that's just good to know that coming from Strine himself, these kinds of issues are being considered, I think, in a way that should be at least motivating for those of us who want to see them move forward. So I'll just close again by saying I think that Wilma, who I think might still be here, but the fact that we have both the former chair of the NLRB and the former Chief Justice of the Delaware Supreme Court writing about this topic is a good thing to know. And I really appreciate comments and feedback, and I'll just put my website where you can find what I've been working on. So thanks very much.
Wonderful. Thank you, Lenore. I turn now to my colleague and co-author, Richard McIntyre, who will introduce the topic and deliver our paper.
I hope Michael didn't raise your hopes too much for this talk, because it's mostly a methodological talk. I do make a couple of substantive points, but this was mostly to, can you see my slides? Is that good? Yeah, okay.
We don't see your slides.
We don't see your slide. How about now?
Still not. Are you a co-host? Like, are you able to?
Okay, how about now?
Got it.
Okay. So this was really a way for Michael and I to organize our thoughts about what other people have done on this issue of stakeholderism and what kind of contribution we might be able to make. So that's what we did, and a number of people that I'm going to talk about are in the room today. You may disagree with how we characterize your work, but that's okay. I'm going to make a couple of substantive claims, but most of this is methodological. I'm going to outline, though, how we understand the specific issue of financialization in this discussion of stakeholderism. Now, at last year's LIRA meetings, we tried to account for why there was so much talk of shareholderism recently. BlackRock, Larry Fink, the Business Roundtable. Why are folks talking about this? And one cynical answer is, well, they were afraid of Elizabeth Warren, and they should be. But we do think that there's something more substantive going on, and the person who has done probably the most work on this is a woman named Rebecca Henderson at Harvard Business School. Michael likes this book more than I do, but if you want to know what people at Harvard Business School are reading, this is the book you want to get a hold of. We call these managerial approaches to this question. And what we mean by that is if managers know and do the right thing, then all the problems will go away. And this goes back to the work of Friedman and Jensen and Meckling back in the 1970s, who talked about why it is only shareholders that matter. What Henderson and the Business Roundtable and Larry Fink do, we call neoclassical plus. In other words, they have the neoclassical model of how the economy works in their mind, but it doesn't quite work that way in their view. There's too many frictions. It doesn't quite get there, and so it needs help. And the help that it needs is everyone should take Rebecca Henderson's seminar on reimagining capitalism, and we should have better managers and everything will be fine. This has some obvious problems. We don't think they're entirely cynical, but we don't think they're entirely serious either. They're completely, to use an old language, instrumental. If you put the right people in the right places, things will work. They don't recognize the structural problems that our society has. Then there are a broad series of people, including many people in this room, who we characterize as taking a kind of institutional approach to the problem of corporate governance. That behavior now is not understood, in the terms of neoclassical economics, that it's understood as coming from or embedded in institutions. And therefore, analysis needs to start with uncovering the rules that govern the relevant institutions. And we think that all the folks that we have read and admired who've done good work in this area, Kochen and Osterman, Applebaum and Batt, David Weil, Sandy Jacoby, Lazanik and Shin, and Lazanik, not just that book, but many, many contributions, and Lenore Palladino's stuff, which I've just begun to read, we think that they all do this, and that there is no neoclassical process revealed in any of this behavior. There's no sense that the system grinds out some kind of optimal position, that the best position is that the one that the parties can agree to when the parties have equal power, which in these cases, they don't. As much as we admire all that work, we want to do, and we're trained to do, something a little bit different. And so our method is grounded in Marx's political economy. Most of us in this room are at least familiar with Volume 1 of Capital, where Marx analyzes commodity fetishism, the labor process, the reserve army of labor, the growth of giant enterprise, and the origins of capitalism. And in that book, it's mostly two actors, capitalists and workers. In the US, capitalists have been pretty unified in their opposition to organized labor. So Volume 1, actually, in our view, works pretty good to cover most of the history of capitalism in the United States. And I have this little picture here that I once got at the Brimfield Fair in Massachusetts. It was a wood block, and it's a lovely piece from Italy back in the 1920s. It is meant to be illustrative of Marx's analysis in Volume 1. We want to draw, though, on the other two volumes of Capital, which are mostly read only by people who have a long prison sentence. But in these two volumes, Marx breaks up the capitalist in a sense, deconstructs the capitalist to transportation, commercial capital, banking capital, landed property, and other groups alongside the discussion of industrial capitalists and workers. And while capitalists tend to be unified in that they all oppose labor, especially in the United States, they are split by their competition over the division of the surplus. The board of directors, in our view, is the first receiver of the surplus. And we're just going to, by surplus, we're just going to mean the difference between net revenue and input and labor costs. The board of directors receives that surplus in value form and then has to pay it out to all kinds of groups that can make claims on that surplus using whatever ideological and legal tools they have available. In our era of supposed financialization, but what Marx would call the prevalence of fictitious capital, this is especially important. Fictitious capital for Marx was claims to future value that have no basis in current production. And in Capital, Volume 3, he analyzed credit money, public debt, company bonds, company shares. These are all things that promote capitalist development. They make growth faster, but they get out of control because they have a relatively autonomous or maybe even fetishized existence. And this dialectic between supporting capital and undermining it is what Marx meant when he said that the spokespeople for financial capital display a nicely mixed capital or of character of swindler and prophet. Or maybe now after Lazonic, we should say looter and prophet. Capital exists, and this is important to keep in mind, it only exists as the money actually invested in the business. It doesn't have a second life as a share of stock. You know, the Dow Jones Industrial Index is the most reported statistic that we have, as if it were something real. It's the most irrelevant statistic for 90% of the US population. This gets more fantastic with the complex forms of fictitious capital in our era: futures, options, complex derivatives. Fictitious capital has exploded since 1990. And the state seems to be increasingly concerned with preserving the value and the values of fictitious capital. And if you haven't read Robert Brenner's piece in the New Left Review from last year talking about the bailouts of the financial markets during the pandemic, I highly recommend them. Capital accumulation has declined in the major rich countries over the long term. And it's tempting to see this as kind of the financiers' revenge, that they draw out the profits to themselves away from all of these other groups as dividend payments and as stock buybacks and other things. Now, stock buybacks are clearly a pernicious practice, but we see them as more a symptom of the general problem of fictitious capital than a cause. Of the 5 biggest capitalist economies, buybacks are really only important in the United States. Maybe another example of what Michael and I have called American capitalist class exceptionalism in our past work. Finance, does draw more to itself, but financialization has allowed non-financial firms to increase their profits through financial activities. So essentially what enterprises are doing is they're engaging in more financial activities, making more profits, and then distributing more back to the financiers. Now, it's true, as Lazonic and others have argued, that this financialization developed partly to change power relationships between these different groups and led to the restructuring of all these enterprises in the 80s, 90s, and 2000s. One of which Matt talked about eloquently in the last session. They went after unionized enterprises first and foremost because that's where the money was. That's where the money was. Agency theory, the theory of Meckling and Friedman, provided a cover. Claims that firms, they must be running the interest of the owners. Now we know, and I'm not going to get into this because it's already been discussed, there's no legal theory that says shareholders own firms. It's not there. Now, it's embedded in law, as was said earlier, but there's no legal theory that demonstrates this. These restructurings did not make anything more efficient. They did establish a higher profitability norm now that firms must meet. So shareholders now have less risk. They can move in and out of ownership ever so quickly. with deep and liquid financial markets, while workers' risk has increased. I think that one thing that's been missed in this discussion is the connection between financialization and globalization. This capital accumulation downturn has happened despite continued overall profitability for enterprises. And I want you to think about this. The system that we have now resembles what Hobson and Lenin described as imperialism a century ago. We have a dominant financial oligarchy in the center, where workers are increasingly employed in personal service or minor industrial activities, and the rich countries draw tribute from the periphery, both directly in the form of profits and indirectly through unequal exchange. That's the way it looks. The roots of this lie in the post-Bretton Woods liberalization of finance and trade and the great doubling of the world's labor supply in the wake of the collapse of the Soviet Union and the market reorientation of China and India. The great doubling created a giant pool of exploitable labor. Trade liberalization made it easy to move goods from low-wage locations to the center. The elaborate system of global fictitious capital that we have and that led to so many crises was partly developed to shift value from the periphery to the center. You can't have a globalized system of production without a globalized system of finance. And this value was created largely in arm's length subcontracting arrangements between the giant developed country industrial and merchant capitalists and the thousands of new factories across the South. Profits for a company like Walmart come from oligopolistic positions in domestic markets, but also through the ultimate control of international production networks. Thus, domestic capital accumulation is at least partly disconnected from domestic conditions, as investment and employment in low and middle income countries grows, and that graph is industrial employment in those two regions. So that the decline in accumulation must be found elsewhere. It's not just buybacks, it's globalization and the financial oligarchy. So in sum, while industrial and merchant capitalists do pay more of their profits to financiers, they more than make up for that through their own financial activities. For the biggest corporations, we add in profits derived from international operations, including their super exploitation of very low wage labor directly, but more often through transnational subcontracting networks. Stock buybacks are a retrograde and antisocial use of the surplus. They are also qualitatively important only in the US and are part of a larger transnational system that strengthens the financial and commercial oligarchy and weakens worker movements in rich countries. Since the Business Roundtable redefinition of the purpose of the corporation in 2019, very little has actually happened. Don't hold your breath. But if nothing else, the statements and activities of powerful financiers like Larry Fink and organized capitalist groups like the Business Roundtable have brought a serious intercapitalist conflict over corporate governance into the open. Proprietary capitalists in the energy sector, which makes up 1/3 of the value of all stocks, by the way, and their political and academic allies are waging a campaign to maintain shareholder primacy. And I refer you to David Gellis's article in the Times last week, May 27th. It is this moment of intercapitalist conflict that has been conducive to progressive change in the past. Thomas Ferguson, back in the day, demonstrated that a coalition of internationally oriented oil companies and banks were willing to tolerate the more moderate aspects of the New Deal if they were also able to obtain changes in US international economic policy that benefited them. We may be at a similar point now, albeit without Roosevelt's massive majorities in Congress from 1934 to 1938. In probing for ways to take advantage of this situation, we are arguing for seeing the role of the financial oligarchy in a somewhat larger and class-oriented context. We agree with Palladino and others on the need for worker representation on boards and would go somewhat beyond existing proposals for co-determination. We also know that the structure of financial power is embedded in a global system of capitalism now over 30 years old that is invisible to most people, even to many of its active participants. And what I would say in closing is that I remember a book by Wade Jacoby many years ago on German co-determination. And the Germans thought after World War II, what they wanted was worker ownership. The workers wanted worker ownership. They did not want co-determination. What they got from the Americans and the Brits was the American New Deal system with co-determination. It was the existence of a more revolutionary alternative that allowed for reform to happen. Similar with the American New Deal, the United States was very close to revolution in 1935. There were general strikes all over the place. We don't get the Wagner Act without that, I don't think. So I think it's important to have not only a broader context, but some more radical proposals on the table if we're ever going to get the reform that we all want. Thank you.
Thank you, Rick. Okay, we got a good 17 minutes. Rick, do you think you can turn off your...
I'm working on it.
Okay. So welcome the audience. Comments and questions, you can either put them in the chat. I can call on you, or you could raise your hand. Yep, Sandy.
Just a quick comment, and then, well, first I'll say, I don't know if Eileen Applebaum wants to speak, but she and Chip Hunter wrote a report, I don't know, maybe 20 years ago, about worker representation on boards, and particularly unions. And I personally would love to hear her thoughts if she's willing to say it. And just to pick up on something that Richard McIntyre just said, which I think is so interesting, which are the recent attacks on Larry Fink, coming from both the Republican Party, which calls ESG woke investing, and also from folks like Peter Thiel in Silicon Valley, a well-known libertarian, and from Warren Buffett and others. So they are, I think it's primarily about protecting investments in carbon energy industries. Nevertheless, it's interesting, and I have to say, there's also, I fear, a small part of it that is, I mean, on the very, very far right, Fink has been attacked in the way George Soros has for being a Jew. So it's just something to put on your radar.
Absolutely.
Eileen, can we get you to say something? Okay.
Okay, if not, welcome others to comments or questions.
Well, I can jump in. So these were great talks and very provocative. I'm struggling with I mean, both of the Nina's presentation. Oh, that was actually last. I'm getting my sessions mixed up. But Lenore and is that I wonder about representation and how we get it to be effective. So, for example, we have labor representation on pension funds, and they're completely, intimidated by, complications of finance, capital, and you do have a question: how many does it take? What percentage of workers to be on boards? And then we have, worker ownership. So there's a recent example. There's a guy named Pete Stavros, who has started this worker ownership thing in which he is getting worker ownership in private equity owned firms. And, what turns out is that, the workers who are there, they get a share of the take when they exit. And we also have an example of an incredible company that Bill Lazonick studied called Nipro, which was a totally worker-owned company. And they made a lot of money. They did great. And it was a really, high performance systems type organization. And then it was bought out by another company, and the workers, the senior workers, totally went for it because they cashed out and they left all their junior workers in Shitsville, because the large corporation. So this is kind of the theme of, getting workers to buy into capitalism. And, how do you, get them to participate while also kind of maintaining their stand. And of course, in Germany, I know we have union backing of works councils. That's a centerpiece to making sure that union presence is maintained. But it is really a struggle, and this is not just it's not a criticism of you, but it's really trying to figure out how you make this stuff work.
Lenore and Nina, do you want to both respond?
I mean, I think I would mostly agree. I think, none of this is easy. It's a wonderful gift to be an academic and get to sort of think about all these issues. But I do think that the, where I've been focused is trying to help policymakers who want to put out proposals that they know are not going to pass. So this goes also to some other points people raised in previous sessions about the Supreme Court and all of that. The more that we get, I think, a variety of different proposals out there that challenge shareholder primacy and empower workers, the better for people's imagination, the better for pressuring Democrats to do anything. But I don't have any, I don't see us going from 0 to 100 in any way. So that's sort of a half answer. And then I think that, this stream obviously didn't have all of the sort of really rich debates that are happening around reforming labor law. But I think that, thinking about corporate law and labor law together is actually, as we sort of try to hope for there to be in, the medium term, more political possibility. That's also why I found this topic, for me at least, really want to pursue, and why I think, as I said in the plenary, like there's a lot of people in the sort of law and political economy space that I think are learning themselves more about labor issues, and they might have the impression that we just need to raise the minimum wage and we'll be done. So it's a sort of widening an aperture into worker power and worker voice in a useful way.
And I think to dovetail with what Lenore is saying, and also what you and Sandy were talking about in your presentations in the previous panel, if we think about different policy proposals for how to give workers more say in how their employing corporation is run, I mean, we might see sort of an order of desirability. Like, for example, we might prefer a system in which some critical mass of workers are given more input at the board level, not just, I don't like the word token representation, but having 1 or 2 workers on a board is not it's not going to change much. We might think about other we might think about that as still preferable to the potential of giving workers more stockholding potential in the corporation that they work for. So like when one reads this shareholder stakeholder literature, shareholders are stakeholders. And so one way to make workers, give workers theoretically more democratic input is to make them shareholders, but that leads to all of those complications and perverse incentives that Sandy and you talked about, like changing workers' incentives from a more sustainable workplace towards one that is potentially more profit oriented. And I think for me, what I take away from all of this is that worker presence on boards is not a panacea. It must be pursued alongside measures that make it easier for workers to form unions, measures that sustain union membership, and so on. So I see these as operating in tandem rather than necessarily one thing more desirable than another.
Yeah, I want to add a quick comment. Having read Lenore's paper a couple of days ago, I commend people to read that paper. If for nothing else, she gets towards the end of it, she really works her way through a thicket of operational details if we were to put a policy like the Reward Work Act into place. I was really fascinated by what you had to say about the NLRB playing a role of having expertise in figuring out who the workers are and then how they would have access to this. So we have 7 minutes, so comments or questions?
You've got Bill has his hand up.
Oh, Bill, there you go.
Hi, yeah, I want to react to Rick's presentation, which I found really interesting, because in all this, I come out of economics. Economics, it's a morass. And basically, whether you know it or not, what's taught to millions of economic students every year by PhD economists since Samuelson put out his stupid textbook is that the most unproductive firm is the foundation of the most efficient economy. I have a paper on that if you want to read it, and you'll see the proof of this. But basically, it's the smaller the firm is, the more unproductive the firm is, the less workers work, the more perfect the competition. That's really what's being taught, and that's the way economists start. That makes the market omnipotent and the firm impotent in all this. And so part of it, the turning that on its head, is to say, no, the firm is very powerful, or can be very powerful. That's where the allocation of resources happens. Markets, we love markets, but markets are outcomes, not causes of a successful economy. The ability to change jobs, ability to borrow money, the ability to buy homes, whatever, to buy different products. Okay, now, but I would say, hearing Rick talk about Marx in economics, which that's my first job at Harvard University was as assistant professor to teach Marxian economics, and a job created by Kenneth Arrow. So there's some of the contradictions that you have, at least in economics. But a lot of my early work was on looking at Marx in the context of the 19th century and not assuming he got everything right. And in turn, I didn't know whether he did, but when I looked at it, he got a lot of things wrong. And one of the things he got wrong was when he thought in the cotton textile industry that technology just destroyed the power of workers, turned them into a fragment of a man, an appendage of a machine, made women and children, do all the work and threw all the men out of work. It didn't happen. In fact, the group of workers that he thought that happened to, which were called mule spinners, which were a very important group of workers in a leading industry, became the best organized and best financed union in all of Britain, and was very important for understanding the rise of the Labour Party. And I would actually go even further than that, something that Rick said. It's very important to understand why buybacks aren't as strong in Britain as they are in the United States. And we've just finished a study of called From Financialization to Innovation in UK Big Pharma on AstraZeneca, GlaxoSmithKline, where over the last decade, to remain independent companies in global competition, they've stopped doing stock buybacks very explicitly to try to focus on innovation and remain independent. Otherwise, they would have gotten taken over by companies in other countries, and Pfizer tried to do this. So I'm summarizing like 200 years of history, but there's a lot of theory that needs to be brought to bear on this in relation to this empirical work. And the critiques of the theory, particularly like things like stuff that Rebecca Henderson is spouting at Harvard, I mean, it's very important to do that critique, or else you're going to get this cabal of elites who are going to say, yeah, we're going to change the system, we're having debate, and there's no real debate. Because it's not just that the pandemic didn't change anything. The pandemic made it much worse. The last thing I'll say is there was an article in the New York Times yesterday, I think, by Lydia DePillis, who I don't know, but I subsequently had communication with her, and which talked about greedflation. And she interviewed all the usual suspects who don't talk about stock buybacks, which including David Otor and Josh Bivens. EPI never talks about them. And I wrote her a note and I said, hey, you forgot something. And she wrote back right away, took her credit and said, yeah, oh, I did. I know all about this stuff, but I didn't think about it. And greedflation, the pandemic, what's been going on, inflation now, and you don't talk about companies pumping up their profits so that they can do more stock buybacks. And then you look at the evidence on this for this past year and this year, you just cannot leave that stuff out of the equation. And the reason they do it is because they really don't understand it. I really believe that they're, and it's not just right wingers, there's a lot of progressives just do not understand the theory of the firm, the theory of how firms operate. It's really, really fundamental. So that's all I'll say about that.
Okay, to wrap up, and we have a few minutes, and I'm going to hope a few people might want to stick around to sort of fill this out. I want to give Rick a chance to respond to Bill, and then I want to call in Steve and Sylvia for the last question. Rick?
Oh, I'll be really brief. I mean, I cut out the part where we say we don't agree with Marx on everything. We don't think his theory is a template to apply to today. I read that paper, Bill, a long time ago. It's an excellent paper. But we do think that this discussion of the division of the surplus and how political projects get built around trying to grab more of that is a worthwhile project.
And I'll add just a bit as a co-author of the paper that just to sort of further clarify this is sort of a think piece to orient will be a historical and popular book that we want to write. And I think at the heart of the matter is that we want to look at the fact that there's different kinds of capital within capitalism, and to retrace the history of the neoliberal era since around 1980 by looking at the way historians of capitalism have, like you think of Julia Ott's History of Wall Street, as well as Louis Hyman's, as Nelson Lichtenstein's History of Walmart, that there are these sections of capital that have arisen historically, and that there's a complex story to tell about what happened since 1980, both in terms of the divisions of capital domestically and globally, thing one, and then thing two is what kind of political constellations around these particular groups. Rick made this observation about a history that Ferguson did of what happened in the 30s, and I think that there's something at work now. So last but not least, a very important contributor on the topic of corporate governance in Germany, Steve and Sylvia is here with us. And Steve, you get the last question today.
Thanks, Mike. I appreciate it. I just have two things to say. They're not so much questions, but they're comments. One is I think it's important not to fetishize getting a majority on a board. That, you know, there's the old line that Woody Allen had of 90% of genius is just showing up. And I think the idea of critical mass is important. You know, and when you look at boards, I think 90% of oversight is having presence. So I agree that a single board member who's a worker rep, those have not panned out well. But once you get to the third of the board being employee representatives, then the other reps on the board, they do have to talk to you. And some of it is, what minimum do you need on the board to put something on the agenda? But don't fetishize getting a majority, because even in Europe, there's no board that has worker majority on it in practice, that whenever there's parity, management gets a second vote. The second thing that I wanted to say is I think Lenore is very good. I really love Lenore's work. And I think that, the point that she talked about on the one hand, you can't import something in whole cloth from Europe. But on the other hand, it's very dangerous if you just take one piece. One example is employee representation on corporate boards. German works councils are very good at ensuring that it's actually employee representatives who end up on the board. If we had a system in the US where we just had elections of workers, the risks would be substantial. Management would try to put up their own candidates, they'd try to capture it. And so any legislation would have to have a mechanism to ensure that the candidates that are employee candidates really are employee candidates and aren't, in greater or lesser nefarious ways put up by management to block real employee voice.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Steve. That was a great final contribution today. So I want to thank all of you who've participated in the audience in particular. I want to thank you very much, the participants in the panels today, Rose Batt, Sandy Jacoby, Nina Eichacker, Lenore Palladino. Did I say Bill Lazanik, Matt Hopkins, myself, and Richard McIntyre? I may have missed somebody there, but it's been really great to have this focused discussion of corporate governance and financialization. Felt like it was a pretty high level discussion today, and glad for all of you to participate. And I'm wondering if those people I just named would be willing to stay around for 2 minutes just to talk about maybe organizing a post-mortem. Sound good? Okay, well, thank you to the audience.
Thanks, everybody.
I think I can turn the recording off at this point.